I think it's fair to say that we are living in a golden era of fighting games, or at least we are reaching there with this year's Evo being the most attended event that also featured the biggest tournament for Street Fighter 3rd straight, a game released in 1999 and the biggest Tekken tournament ever. It was at the start of this year, with the release of Tekken 8, that I first became curious about a genre that I hadn't experienced in years. So both out of nostalgia and the hype surrounding it, it seemed like the perfect time to become part of this community again. And I had a blast with that game. So much so that I went back to experience all the titles in the franchise, study up the lore, and other titles in the genre like Street Fighter and Blaze Blue. I became obsessed with fighting games to the point of wanting to make a video about it. But it all started with a series that has stayed with me since I first played it as a child. There are several aspects of fighting games that gravitate me. The thrill of PvP combat, whether through martial arts, weapons, or just creative mechanics that go out of their way to add another layer of insanity. Fighting against someone with the result purely being dictated through your own strategies against another player, and how the larger battle unfolds. The distinct and unique characters that complete the world, their expression, different modes, and probably the most important aspect being the world itself. What makes fighting games unique from other video games is the amalgamation of both multiplayer and the single player experience. Every fighting game has its own world with their own distinct lore, and different IPs choose different ways for the player to interact with that world through various modes. Tekken 3 is a game that achieves it in such a memorable fashion that to me perfectly sums up how much an interesting world adds to a game, but also how it functions the narrative of that world. A good world isn't decided by how complex it is. An interesting world is one that is able to present its setting and characters in a believable fashion with its own distinct appeal that differentiates it from other IPs. It's how one decides to infuse the narrative to that world and how the ideas are communicated that makes the fighting game intriguing and a world that people want to be a part of. Take Street Fighter for example. The lore of that world isn't that complex or deep necessarily. The stage from Street Fighter Alpha 2, however, perfectly encapsulates everything special about Street Fighter, more so than any story mode or a lore video ever could. This retro-infused nostalgic simplicity of a girl fighting in a backyard with a big brother playing video games became iconic due to that. To contrast, Tekken goes for a complete opposite vibe. It has a more futuristic, edgy personality, with a pinch of supernatural and mystery surrounding it and pairs. Tekken 3 was a accumulation of the first two games. It felt both like a finale and a new start with it being a new generation title. Those previous ideas were carried, with new ones introduced. It was a series of conflicting tones that shared one reality. The mystery that permeated the entire game was and still is quite alluring. As good as the atmosphere in Tekken 2 was, it just didn't feel as complete, and with the sidestep mechanics, a much more refined gameplay and graphics that were so ahead of their time, it became a sensation. It was my first game as a child. The reason why I came back, and I'm pretty sure that's the case for a lot of people, the idea of Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan, a Tiger Mask inspired pro wrestler, all inhabiting the same world with a Kung Fu bear and whatever Buskanovich is. The sheer terror you face first encountering Oko. It was the first time the story was constructed in a way that suited a fighting game. And by that, I mean how every character had stakes and motivation in that game. And the stakes of fighting tournament couldn't be higher with a literal god there, who is also killing off important past characters while also continuing the main narrative of the series. Tekken 3 to me represents everything that makes Tekken special, and arguably the one that had the perfect balance of the turns and confidence in its ability to progress that also transferred in commercial success. It's a world of different tones existing together. It is both an action sci-fi thriller, a love letter to martial arts, a story that could still be taken seriously even when the absurd aspects were present, that only added to the experience. However, as much as I want to think of it in this way, it's also partially a product of its time. And what I mean is that much of the mistake comes from the visuals, that were clearly an upgrade from the previous game, not realistic enough, which only added to the atmosphere. That phenomena is quite common in many video games in fact. The period of games where a transition to 3D was happening, where the goal was simply to make graphics realistic, but wasn't possible due to the technological limitations, gave the game this weird aesthetic that has aged wonderfully. Though, having said all that, there's one more thing that factors into my love for Tekken 3. Yoshimitsu is an enigma. He is one of the most unique characters I've ever encountered in gaming. First, seeing him in Tekken 3 being the only swordsman in the cast made him stand out. His design had this otherworldly aura to it where you weren't sure if he was a samurai or some mystical force. He, to me, in some ways, is the soul of the series without being a major character in the Mishima saga. From the very first game, this was the description used for him, and each following entry has experimented with his design and gave their own unique take on it. So much so that once a character who looked like this became this eldritch monstrosity by Tekken 7. He even transcends the series and is simultaneously a main character in two major IPs. But Tekken 3 specifically to me was not only the best Yoshimitsu because it had my favorite look and a moveset heavily influential to the following entries, but it had this moment that had stayed with me all these years. The first time seeing this moment is what truly made me fall in love with the game. I had no explanation for what was happening. It had no story relevance, but this moment never escaped my mind. It felt like I'd unlocked some secret code that I wasn't supposed to. Tekken Tag Tournament was the next game in the franchise. It was a tag team spin-off game that was mostly an updated version of the previous game, with one of the most unique final bosses in Tekken. After this, following an ambitious but ultimately a disappointing release with Tekken 4, the series desperately needed another sensation like Tekken 3, as the sales were reducing with each entry, and that it got with Tekken 5. For many, the peak of the series, and it's not hard to see why. Tekken 5 is a great game as Tekken 4 is tragic. It's a game drenched in the Y2K aesthetic of early 2000s, a game that has the impossible task of succeeding Tekken 3 while also moving the franchise forward. It somehow is not only able to be a worthy successor to Tekken 3, but in some ways is much more grand in its scope. There's a sense of deep sadness and dread that permeates every aspect of this game. I think the best way to highlight what makes this game so unique is its approach to narrative. Narrative in fighting games can range from character endings in arcade modes to a full blown cinematic experience or a visual novel included in the game. How the game communicates its story ranges from how the modes are used to tell either concise canonical series of events or more ambiguous character specific experiences. But it's fair to say that narrative is always the secondary thought after character designs and a moveset, and there's nothing wrong with that. But Tekken 4 deviates from this. Upon starting the game, you see Kazuya, the protagonist from the previous entry, return in an epic fashion. The art style feels much more grim and grounded. Going through the menu, one notices Jin's absence from the character select screen, a follow-up to him being betrayed in the previous game. Beyond that, the lack of any music makes everything more unsettling. When you pick up a character, you're met with these stylized illustrations showing the unique tone of the game. The gameplay feels even more realistic with a heavy emphasis on sidestepping and environments. The music playing in the background is different from your typical fighting game, with choices of mostly ambient mellow tracks that creates the mood perfectly. After beating Heihachi and getting the ending, you suddenly notice Jin is now available, revealing that he was an unlockable. The way this is done paints the character arc of Jin in the game in such a subtle manner, while also immediately highlighting his new look, which is followed up by him completely abandoning his fighting style, thus again heavily changing the protagonist in some way in typical Tekken fashion, and also something that was very rare at the time. And besides him, every character again has interesting motivations behind them, while getting a new, very different look that is still very iconic and probably the last time the character was taken seriously in any way. Martial law dealing with depression, etc. If previous game revolved around the single tournament, here characters are the main focus, and how they deal with being in the world of Tekken. There is so much more to this game that was way ahead of its time, and sadly, the harsh part was that it didn't meet the desired expectations and scared the devs to the point that not only has Tekken ever attempted anything this ambitious, but the mature aesthetic has also been completely avoided. Which sucks because had Tekken 4 succeeded, I wonder how the Tekken series would be like now. But remember when I said Tekken 3 to me is Tekken, I meant that Tekken 3 has everything that I like about Tekken as a franchisee. And Tekken 4 to me is something completely different to that. It has a different approach that, because of being forgotten, is not remembered in the zeitgeist like Tekken 3 does. And a part of me wonders how different the series would be right now if every game after Tekken 4 shared its experimental spirit. But what we have now feels mostly just an extension of Tekken 3. As good as it is, it just doesn't feel anything new has been done to the franchise since Tekken 3, and with a story that has largely overstayed its welcome.
I'm here now. I'm doing the best I can. But are you now? It's your dreams
Which brings me to Tekken 8, a game that I love, and not because it's trying to be anything new again, but because it feels like the best version of whatever Tekken became post Tekken 4. The gameplay is better than ever, and it actually introduces mechanics that significantly improve the game in a good way. And the story mode, as much as I don't like cinematic story modes, it is easily the best version of that. So what's next? From the interviews and looking at the landscape of modern fighting games, it seems like the game will be supported for quite a few years. And if that's the case, we really need some kind of story DLC, preferably something that goes past the Mishima saga, as for the first time since Heihachi threw Kazuya in the volcano, it feels like we can finally move past that and focus on the characters and do something different in the world. With the ending of Yoshimitsu, I'm hopeful he gets something important in the series, and I'm really curious whether his Soul Calibur connection is gonna factor in any way. The current team has also indicated that Tekken 9 might be their final project, and if that's the case, I really hope the series goes bold again and tries something experimental, especially now that Tekken has become so huge. And I hope Tekken 8 marks the end of story modes and the series tries something different like the World 2 mode in Street Fighter 6. But yeah, I've really become a fan of fighting games again, and not just Tekken. It's a special time to be a fan, and if you're looking to get into the genre, then I highly recommend to just pick any one title that you find aesthetically pleasing with a good netcode and enjoy. I might make another video on this topic real soon and look forward to more stuff that I have planned out for the rest of the year. Until next time,